All right. Well, was God really silent for 400 years between the Old and New Testaments? Does history impact our reading of Scripture and the cultural context into which Jesus arrived? And how should we make sense of all of the extra Jewish literature from that period between Malachi and Matthew? Things like Tobit and Judith and 1 Enoch, the controversial text that everyone is TikToking about. Well, welcome to Questioning Christianity, the channel trying to help you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. My name is Dan Patterson, and my guest today is the Reverend Dr. George Athas. George is a lecturer at Moore College. He actually heads up the postgrad research department as well as church history and Old Testament. He has his PhD from the University of Sydney, and perhaps most notably, the thing he's become famous for is this brilliant new volume, Bridging the Testaments, which is a dive into what people have often called the intertestamental period, but he's going to try and take a sledgehammer to that language today. So without any further ado, it is my honor to be able to invite George onto the channel. Hey, George, great to have you.
Hey, Dan, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Well, George, I've looked forward to having you on the channel for a while because I've been a Christian now for nearly 2 decades, and I can't count the number of times I've heard popular or celebrity pastors or famous authors speak of God's silence for 4 centuries between the last book of our Protestant Bible, the book of Malachi, and then the opening of the New Testament with Matthew. It's all through the children's Bibles that I read to my kids, just this assumption that nothing really significant was happening in those periods. But you brilliantly raise in Bridging the Testaments that leaves a bunch of curiosities then about how we understand the role of John the Baptizer as the last of this line of prophets that Jesus points to, how he makes sense of a lot of the sects and problems and questions and theological controversies of the time of Jesus, and how we kind of close the Old Testament with really the Persians in power, and then all of a sudden there's an entirely new empire on the scene in the New Testament, and radically different challenges that Judah and the Jewish people are facing, and all of the changes that have happened in their theology over that period. So I'm looking forward to be able to throw some questions your way. Maybe just to kick things off, what prompted you to write Bridging the Testaments, and what's your feeling around this whole language around the intertestamental period or the silence of God across those 4 centuries?
Well, every time I hear intertestamental period or silence, I just cringe because no one in the Bible seems to think that there is such a period. And so it really isn't biblical. And yet, ironically, we see it constantly in Christian circles. I hear it from the pulpit many times and have throughout the years. The impetus for the book came from my teaching in the classroom, really. I teach a course on Zechariah here at Moore College in Sydney, and have been for nearly 20 years now. And the book of Zechariah in the Old Testament arguably covers an historical period of about 200 years. And most of my students, who are actually in their final year of study, when they come to those 200 years, it's still at that point quite a mystery to them. It's quite a black hole. They know a little bit about what happened, particularly at the beginning of the period. They're okay with that. But as time goes on, it's just a blank. And, I found that I was constantly having to, introduce my students to what happened during this period. And not just simply what happened, but what were the theological developments that happened during this period? Because once we understand both what happened and the theology that came out of the period, it sets us up not just simply to know what's going on at the end of the Old Testament period, but it really sets us up for the New Testament as well. And my students were always coming to me saying, well, where can we go? What's the one book that we can go to that has all the info? And I couldn't give them one single reference. I'd be sending them to this book and that book and this journal and that. And in the end, I thought, right, I'm going to write the book.
That's a good reason.
So I did. Yeah, and so I did.
Yeah.
And it ended up being a far bigger book than either I or the publisher envisioned at first. I mean, as you can see, the size of the book, it's a block of flats.
Well, you can definitely use it as maybe a foundation stone for the rebuilding of the temple if that ever happens in the future. Your book can serve as a cornerstone.
That was the motivation for the book. The book is actually devoted it's dedicated to my students.
That's great. Well, one thing I really appreciated about it is you open the physical copy of it. I also listened to it over Audible. At least we chatted. I think I listened to the first half of it over Audible, but
Yeah,
I've flicked through it because they do it in 2 volumes, such a long
that's
recording.
right.
But it
Yeah.
opens with some great historical charts. And so if you're just curious, what happened from the successive Babylonian and then Medes and Persian Empire down to the Greeks and how that is divided up into 4 different nations, and then what happens with this Hasmonean era, which is a period of time that very few people will have heard about, but with the priests ruling there in Jerusalem, and then ultimately into the Roman era. And so you kind of cover who are the major rulers and what are the major players, what are the key events, all just these really useful charts. One thing I loved about the book was just the way it's written in narrative style. It doesn't feel boring or laborious to be able to get through. You really do feel like you're on this adventure through history. So kudos to you just for being able to write such a big book, but keep people really engaged along the way. In there, you've got this real laser focus on being able to try and debunk this idea that God is either inactive or not speaking through that period of time. What are some of the arguments that lead you to that conclusion?
Yeah, well, starting off with what we see in the New Testament, as I mentioned earlier, no one in the New Testament seems to think that God had fallen silent or that he'd been inactive. Quite the opposite, actually. When Jesus talks about, prophets, he says that the prophets kept speaking up until John the Baptizer. If anything, Jesus sees a kind of crescendo rather than a silence. And it all culminates with John the Baptist, who then points to him as the Messiah. So Jesus doesn't think that there was a period of silence. When Stephen in the book of Acts stands up in front of the Sanhedrin, he makes a very similar claim. He says to the members of the Sanhedrin, who are the ruling, the governing body in Judaism in the first century, and he says to them, "You're always resisting the Holy Spirit." And he's not saying to them, "Hey, you haven't found personal salvation in Jesus." What he's saying there is, you are resisting God's word given through the prophets, and you keep doing this, and that has resulted in your rejection of the righteous one, Jesus, the Messiah. And so Stephen thinks that, God has always been speaking, and that this reached a critical point with Jesus. The writer to the Hebrews in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, he starts off his work by saying, in the past, in various ways, down through the ages, God spoke through the prophets, and in the last of these days, he spoke through his Son, that is, through Jesus. So the writer there thinks that God has been continuously speaking, sending prophets, and once again, it culminates in the coming of Jesus. So,
and you mentioned in the book
Testament,
too that you've got these other figures, Simeon and Anna, which show up in the birth narratives of Jesus,
that's right.
serving in this prophetic role, declaring the arrival of Jesus.
Exactly.
It had been long told, like Simeon, before I die, I'm going to see the arrival of this Messiah.
Right.
And so
no
you've
one
got this
thinks,
prophetic role still being played out.
Yeah, exactly. No one thinks, "Oh goodness, look, there's a prophet. Where did they come from?" There's no
It just
surprise
seems to be normal.
that.
Yeah,
Exactly. There's no surprise that there is an Anna or a Simeon there who are identified quite readily as prophets, because prophets were there. We don't necessarily know the names of lots of them. We do know the names of some of them, but they were certainly there. They were certainly active, and that also lines up with what we see in the Old Testament about God's character. One of the ways God says that he would guide his people is by sending prophets. And he's actually, one of the signs of his covenantal faithfulness to his people is the fact that he continually sends them prophets. And it's actually quite a theological challenge if for some reason God goes on leave for 4 centuries and doesn't send any prophets. That's a major issue, theological problem. But it just doesn't happen. God continually sends prophets. And so one of the things I wanted to do was try to trace, where does this idea of prophetic silence come from? And I found that the seeds of the idea go back to the 2nd century BC. And essentially it was the people who came to power who were priests. They come to power and they proclaim themselves the fulfillment of God's purposes. And so they basically say to the Jewish people, you need look no further. You don't need to wait for any Messiah or anyone else to come. We're it. God's chosen us. And so there's not going to be any prophet coming along to tell you otherwise. And so from the 2nd century BC, those who hold power in Judaism start to, at first they try to use prophets to their advantage, but then they just start suppressing them because they believe that no one's going to arise who will somehow challenge their power with a word from God to look elsewhere. And so that starts a trend that continues for a few centuries. But it isn't until about the 2nd century AD that we finally see the rabbis, who are the leaders of Judaism in the 2nd century AD. They're responding in part to the challenge of Christianity. A lot of Jews became Christians in the 1st century. And even in the 2nd century AD, the church was still largely Jewish. And so you had a lot of Jews claiming Jesus is the Messiah. He is the culmination of all our prophetic hopes. And the rabbis are countering this claim. They don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. And so part of what they do is to say, well, no, Jesus can't be the Messiah. And he can't even be a prophet because God stopped sending prophets, speaking through prophets centuries before Jesus came around. And so they specifically say, God stopped speaking about 400 years before Jesus, and therefore Jesus can't be the Messiah, and the church's claims can't be right.
That's so interesting. So you've got this anti-prophet, therefore anti-Messiah, therefore anti-Christian polemic to try and suppress the ongoing revelation of God by this priestly class who were in power in Jerusalem. So it's basically what turned out to be an anti-Christian polemic ends up being adopted by the church, and now Christians kind of repeat this idea of God's inactivity or silence for those sort of 4th century. That's a tragedy, kind of historically. So maybe you do need to take a bit of a sledgehammer to that. But I'm interested, one of the other lines of argumentation that you bring in the book is this idea that we often have our mind fixed around how God inspired scripture for a certain period of time, that the Old Testament closes with the book of Malachi, and then you don't have more inspired scripture for another 4.5 centuries after that, with the writing of the New Testament letters with Paul and then the Gospels and everything else that follows. Your argument in here is, well, that's not exactly how the authorship and final coming together of scripture functioned either. Do you want to spell that out a little bit more, just around what was happening with inspired books over those centuries from the time of Malachi through to the beginning of Matthew?
Yeah. If God was still actively guiding his people through prophetic figures, then we have to say that things were still being written. Not every prophet was a writing prophet. We have the names of prophets in the Old Testament whom we know about, and yet we don't have any book from that prophet. And so, but it's reasonable to expect that if there were prophets, things were still being written down, and some of it has ended up in our canon of the Old Testament. And so, even in those centuries, in those 4 centuries before Jesus, we have biblical books of the Old Testament still being written and still being developed. I think one of the things that is difficult for us in our day and age is to understand what a book is. For us, it's just, something that's published, it comes off the printing press, or I can download it and boom, there's the finished product, done. I can just read the whole thing. But the ancient world was very different, especially in the Old Testament period. They didn't really have such a thing as a book. I prefer to talk about documents that they had. So, like you open your laptop and you work on a document, and then you close it and you come back and you change it and save it, and then you might do another version of it. That's how they worked on books or documents in the Old Testament. What we see happening is when the Jews come back from exile in Babylon in the late 6th century BC, they come back from Babylon and they're trying to rebuild Jerusalem, which had been destroyed 70 years earlier. And they start this community, and it's quite a struggling community. It's a small community. And there is another community of Israelites or Sumerians, the remnants of the northern kingdom of Israel, which had been destroyed a few centuries earlier. They're just to the north of Jerusalem, and they're a thriving community. But in the mid-5th century, along comes Ezra. And Ezra is a priest, and he part of what he's responsible for is ensuring that the law, the Torah, what we know as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through to Deuteronomy, he makes sure that they become the cultural standard for anyone who worships the God of Israel, Yahweh. And so the law effectively becomes a canonical collection in about 450 BC, thereabouts. And that really starts to change the complexion of both the Jews in Jerusalem and down south in Judah, as well as the Sumerians, who will later become the Samaritans, as we call them in the New Testament. And so the law becomes a standard canonical collection. The difference between those two communities, down south we've got the Jews who are centered in Jerusalem. The importance of Jerusalem comes from the prophetic traditions. The only reason Jerusalem is important is because there is a David. God chooses David in the Old Testament to become king over Israel, and God makes a covenant with David. And part of this covenant involves God himself becoming the father figure of the dynasty of David. We might, even put it as God becoming a member of the Davidic dynasty. And so because you have these prophetic traditions that stipulate Israel is a Davidic kingdom, its capital is in Jerusalem, there is a temple that must be in Jerusalem, and the temple is not just simply a place of worship, it's also a political monument to God's commitment to the Davidic dynasty. All of those things mean Jerusalem is non-negotiable. It is an absolute must for the identity of God's people. But up in the north, in Samaria, they couldn't care less about prophetic traditions or the Davidic dynasty. They're in complete denial about all of those things. And because the Sumerians up north are the bigger, more vibrant, thriving community down south in Jerusalem, they're really struggling most of the time. The only way that they're able to make their claims and theological arguments for the prophetic traditions is to write books and develop books and collect them. And so from roughly this time, the mid-5th century BC onwards, we also start to see the development of what we call the prophetic canon, the books which in the Hebrew canon, we've got three parts to the three divisions in the Hebrew canon. There's the law, then we've got the prophets, and then later on we'll have the writings. The books of the prophets, which include, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and then all the books with prophetic names on them. That starts to develop as a canon from roughly the 5th century BC onwards. And it's part of the way that the community that's centered in Jerusalem is able to keep its claims about God's promises to David alive in the face of what is the more popular version of worshipping Yahweh, which is up north. There's another temple, there's a rival temple up north, and there's a lot more people worshipping Yahweh at that rival temple than in Jerusalem. And so they're putting together the traditions that have been handed down to them through the centuries. They are collecting them together, and so we start to see this collection of the prophets. And we also start to see the collection of other books that are associated with David, such as the Psalms, collections associated with Solomon, like Proverbs, etc., etc. Yeah. But because God is, even through these centuries, still sending prophets to his people, it's testament to the fact that God has this ongoing dynamic relationship with his people. He's not a distant God who's, just kind of sets things up and then goes away and then every now and then comes back to check on them. He's actively involved. He wants to guide his people, and so he's always sending prophets, speaking to them. And as he's doing that, people are learning more about God. If you think about the way any relationship works, any long-term relationship, it starts here, but then it's going to develop through time. You know someone more down the track than when you did at the beginning.
Totally.
And so
you'd hope so.
Yeah, exactly. And so
if you're being a good friend or a significant other.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And that's exactly what God is. And so it's what I call progressive revelation. God is continually revealing himself to his people, and theology develops down through the ages. And what they're doing at this time is they're sometimes writing new books, but they're also taking the old books and developing them, because they don't think that the old books, the older revelation of God, they don't think that those books have somehow expired in terms of their relevance or authority. Quite the opposite. They think that every generation needs to keep reading these books and understanding them, digesting them, so they can understand God. They can know what God is like. They can know what to expect from God, what God desires, and what he is aiming to do in the future. And so we have editors who I think are just as inspired by God as the original authors. And they're developing the books for later audiences. And they're sometimes producing new prophecies as well that they're putting into these books. One of the things we need to remember is the footnote had not been invented yet. I think if the footnote had been invented, we might be able to see more clearly this is written by an earlier author and this is from a later author. But they hadn't invented the footnote, and so the later authors put their own material in the midst of the older stuff. So it takes a little bit of effort to kind of discern
Think about that.
What's earlier and what's late. Yeah, but it's not completely subjective. There are criteria that we work with to figure that out. But
that's maybe a richer view, if you mind me jumping in, that maybe a bit of a richer view of inspiration than what a lot of people have in their mind when they think, how did scripture get penned? Because people might think, all right, you've got the books of Moses, so the law, the Torah, the 5 books that make up the Pentateuch, and they think, Moses received this revelation, or these events unfolded, and he either writes them down or dictates them, and he puts his final stamp of approval, and there you go, the law is fixed from that point. But even if people have that view of inspiration, you've still got those tricky passages like the recording of the death of Moses within the Torah itself. So you get to the end of Deuteronomy and it lays out this story, and you're like, oh, what did his zombie hand just reach out from the grave to be able to carve this last piece into a tablet of stone or to write it down on some papyri? And so there's this realization, there's other hands that are involved in the authorship of these texts. That doesn't take away the origin story or the authority that comes with it, but it's just this view that God's inspiration involves a longer process of superintending, editing, and a providential role in helping to shape culture and history in order for the Jewish nation to end up with the books that he intends to serve as the revelation that he wants them to wrestle with, to be able to discern who he is through and to shape their prophetic hopes for the future. It kind of comes down to how do we discern, and this may lead to like the Old Testament canon question. How is it then? You've got these two competing centers of Yahwism. So this Samaritan or Sumerian group up north, who will by the New Testament be called the Samaritans, and that you'll see interactions with Jesus and the Samaritan woman, or the disciples wanting to call down fire upon the Samaritan village for not letting Jesus pass through. These obvious tensions that are there. But you've got these two centers in the Old Testament. They each have a temple at Mount Gerizim and built on the 7 hills that make up Jerusalem. How do we know that it's not just, the victors write the history and the books that Judah have are the ones that historically survived because they became a stronger religious center? What is the process of canonization of these Old Testament books and recognizing divine authority? What did that look like? People are probably a lot more familiar with New Testament canonization than they are with Old Testament canonization. Yeah,
I think when it comes to the New Testament, the issue of canonization is a much simpler issue. To put it rather starkly, Paul wrote a letter, put it in an envelope, sent it, bang, there you go, done. When it comes to the Old Testament, we've got centuries of development. The analogy I like to use is, imagine you've got 2 books on the same subject. You've got one book which is published one particular year, and there it is. It talks about a particular subject. But then you've got the next book, the other book next to it. It's on exactly the same subject, but it's in its 12th edition. Now, ask yourself, which one of those two books is likely to be the more authoritative book? It's the one that's in its 12th edition, because the whole point of having new editions is you think this text is really worth reading again and again and again, and it's worth developing. You want new audiences to benefit from it. You have new material that goes into it. You develop it in particular ways. And so the 12th edition book is going to be the one that you go to, rather than just simply the one edition wonder, the one hit wonder kind of thing. And that's how we really need to see the books of the Old Testament. They were deemed authoritative from a fairly early point, primarily because they reflected a perspective that seemed to make sense of Israel's historical experience, or they talked about events that were proved right. The classic litmus test for any prophet is, well, if they make a prediction, see if it comes true or not.
Did it
If
happen?
it does, they're a true prophet. If it doesn't come true, then that they're a false prophet. And so the stuff that comes true, the stuff that makes sense of Israel's experience, that's the stuff, the material that survives. And then this is brought to later audiences, and it's developed by editors. And as I said, we need to think of these editors as, just like the original authors, they are just as inspired by God. They are just as heavily invested in the ongoing revelation of God. We need to remember the Old Testament is an unfinished story. The punchline doesn't come until the New Testament. And so there's always more. There's always more to come. There's always more to know. No one in the Old Testament period knows God completely. We only come to know God completely when we get to the New Testament. And so there has to be this ongoing theological development, the writing down of this theological development, reflection on what's happened, historical processes as well. And then, writing works that are about the identity of God's people and their connection to him, how he's relating to them, and what he is and isn't doing in the world. And so the canon as we have it has come from the Jews. And initially, the Jews centered around Jerusalem, they were the smaller community. The Samaritans were the far bigger community for centuries and centuries.
Did they have a competing collection of scripture?
Their work survives. No, the Samaritans don't seem to have, as far as we know. They subscribe to the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, in their own particular versions. So they have slightly different versions of the first 5 books of the Bible. For example,
do we have those
commandments
extant still?
Yeah, we do. We certainly do. It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. And the 10 Commandments are actually slightly different. They're the same all the way, except they number them differently, because the Samaritans have a different 10th commandment. The 10th commandment says, you shall worship God on the temple on Mount Gerizim. And here are the Google map directions to get to Mount Gerizim to make sure you end up in the right place.
Oh, that's kind of funny, because what historically that temple was built somewhere in the middle of the 5th century, right? BC. Whereas the Torah is, nearly the events of the Torah nearly precede that by a millennia. So it's funny that you do obviously see those historical accretions. But I mean, one of the maybe things that a skeptic who's watching this might now ask, well, you're talking about this providential role of editors shaping the Jerusalem set of scriptures. How do we know that's not the exact same thing, that this isn't really divine revelation, but this is just an evolution of human religion to suit their own agenda? For you, George, what is it that gives the Old Testament scriptures this real divine authority? I mean, we read in the Petrine epistles in the New Testament that no prophecy was given of the will or origin of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. Why do you think you know that when it comes to the Old Testament?
It's a really good question. And the answer, I think, it's a very complex answer, but if I can try and whittle it down. The New Testament says prophecy is God's idea. He's the origin of prophecy. We mustn't think of prophecy, though, as simply God, dropping messages into the laps of authors and they're kind of passively receiving it, and that they're kind of like postmen who then just, deliver it on. The prophets themselves are actively involved in giving shape to the message from God. So one of my colleagues, the way he puts it is, it's about God's word, but the prophets put it into words. And we can see the fingerprint of the writers themselves. We can discern the personality and circumstances of the prophet Amos and how he's different to the prophet Jeremiah, who's different from the prophet Ezekiel, etc., etc. So we can definitely see the human element in it. We often talk about the Bible as the Word of God, which it 100% is. But it's also 100% a human product. So we mustn't think that somehow if there were political processes and, human influences involved, that somehow undermines the divine authority of the scriptures. God actually works through the human authors, not in spite of them.
Kind of like a parallel to the incarnation, that you've got this full divine nature. He's truly God, but also truly human at the same time, that the scriptures have this like kind of character.
Absolutely, absolutely. The other thing that tells me that the scriptures are divine is the fact that over the centuries that we're primarily interested in here, the last 4 or 5 centuries BC, we see a process whereby the ones who should hold power in Judaism, the Davidic royal family, they fall by the wayside. They're no longer seen in the corridors of power. They just become ordinary citizens, plebs. And it's the priests who emerge with ultimate power in Judaism. And this is actually a theological problem for the Old Testament. Priests are never meant to hold ultimate power in the people of God. They're important. You need them. But according to the prophetic traditions, they are only ever meant to be employees of a Davidic king. And yet the priests themselves emerge as the power holders, and then they themselves take on the role of kings at the end of the 2nd century BC. But you still have this promise to David, and you've got people still holding out hope for God to raise someone from the line of David who will challenge the priests and actually point the nation in a new direction and fulfill God's promises to David.
So you feel like the survival of this minority report of Davidic expectation is one of the things that means that's probably not just the victors writing the story.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. The priests need the prophetic traditions which talk about the essential nature of Jerusalem. The priests need a temple in Jerusalem, and the only thing the law doesn't talk about Jerusalem or the need for a temple in Jerusalem at all. That comes only from the prophetic traditions, and the prophetic traditions say Israel is a Davidic kingdom. So the priests need those prophetic traditions to have a Jerusalem and a temple that they can be in. And yet they have to dial down just how loud the Davidic promises are. And yet you've got the people who are consuming the Davidic literature saying, hey, you guys can't be the final word. You can perhaps be interim leaders. There's, an argument for that, but there's no way you guys, the priests, are God's final word. We're still waiting for a Messiah, and who's going to come from the Davidic line. And the prophetic literature survives and even develops in spite of the fact that those who are in power kind of want to dial down Davidic hope, and they can't switch it off completely. And it all comes to fruition in the 1st century when we finally get to Jesus. That's that's the cherry on top of the cake. That we see the fulfillment of these hopes. All of those hopes, they come together in Jesus. And Jesus's interactions, particularly with priests in the Gospels, it just brings everything together, and you see, bam, here is where God fulfills all his prophetic promises in a way that tells you this isn't man's imagination. There is a divine hand behind all of this.
Yeah, I love that. I think the prophetic witness is a huge kind of plank in the argument for inspiration. It's one of the things that biblically seems to set, Yahweh apart is his ability to rightly foretell and providentially then guide history towards these future fulfillments. And certainly Jesus points towards prophecy and fulfillment of prophecy. The New Testament authors and gospel writers say this is the key thing. How you know God is in Jesus of Nazareth, reconciling a lost world to himself, is that he is the one that you see this prophetic portrait pointing towards. And then Jesus' own authority is kind of one for me. I mean, you've got lists of canonical books that are either extant with Jesus, kind of at the same time, you've got Josephus that draws up a list of the 22 or 24 books, depending on how it's there. The Qumran community that have these lists as well. But there is a broad Jewish literature during that period. I mean, there's a range of books that we would call apocryphal books, 7 or 9 of them that are there. You've got the pseudepigraphal books, which is a complex word, kind of meaning they've been written, a false name attributed to these writings to try and give them more authority. You've got Qumran, this other sect, the Essenes in Judaism, that have a whole range of literature that we've uncovered with the Qumran scrolls. And so there's a lot of other literature there, but even the Jewish nation by the time of Jesus seems to have recognized what are the law, the prophets, and the writings of this collection of Old Testament literature that they see as being authoritatively inspired, and kind of Jesus giving that seal that he sees these as the scripture that cannot be broken kind of authority is a big plank in it too. The prophetic one and then Jesus's endorsement of the Old Testament are two big ones kind of on my end. I've got tons of questions though that all of this sparks. If you don't mind, we may have to get you back for another Q&A episode at some point because I'm sure people will send in questions as well from all of that.
It raises a lot of questions,
It raises a lot of questions. And I mean, one of the ones that I find interesting is just the ordering then of the Jewish Bible, because people probably would open an English translation of the Old and New Testaments today, and there's a particular ordering of books in the Old Testament. What was the ordering that the Jews put towards the scriptures as a whole, so their Tanakh or the Jewish Bible?
Yeah, the order of the books as they are in our English Bibles today follows the ordering of the Greek canon. When the Jewish scriptures were translated into Greek, that started in the 260s BC and continued for a few centuries, actually. The Greek Jewish community had a particular order for the books. The law is ordered in exactly the same way, but there are slight differences in the prophets and the writings. And our English Bibles follow that tradition. The Jewish or Hebrew tradition follows essentially what I think is a better ordering, to be honest. I wish our Bible publishers would actually publish Bibles with the Hebrew ordering, because I think it follows a more sensible ordering that reflects, I think, a little bit about how these books developed in history. As I mentioned, the law itself was probably the first recognized canon. The material existed well before 450 BC, but it was canonized or brought together as a definitive collection in 450 BC with the specific statement, Israel, here's your canon. This is what.
So that's the role that Ezra played with the Torah.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And then you've got, so they're the same in both traditions, both the Hebrew and the Greek traditions. Then you've got the prophets, and the prophets tell the story of Israel's history. So it starts with Joshua. Then you've got the book of Judges, no book of Ruth, which in the Greek canon kind of comes after Judges. And the reason it comes after Judges is because Ruth begins with a little line that says, well, in the time of the Judges. And so it seems like a sensible point at which to put, the book of Ruth. But the book of Ruth didn't achieve canonical status until centuries later. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the Hebrew canon has Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and then it goes on to the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the book of the 12. The book of the 12 prophets. In our English Bibles, all those 12 prophets are listed as separate, 12 different entries, and it gives you the impression that they're 12 separate books. But actually, they are a single collection. So it's almost like a little canon within a larger canon.
And Ezra and Nehemiah were considered a single story.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Ezra and Nehemiah is
single...
one book as well. Yeah, that's right. And so the prophets are a canon that it achieves its final form in, I would say, the early 3rd century BC. And the reason for that is I think we can see that the early 3rd century BC was when the Book of the 12 was put together. They took, all these earlier books and they brought it together and said, okay, here's a collection that we call the Book of the 12 Prophets. And then, so that happened in, roughly the 3rd century BC. Some of those books were then continued to be developed after that time as well, but the collection was there. And so the prophets kind of existed from that point. You've got at that point as well the development of a collection of psalms. And the collection of psalms is, it has 5 divisions that kind of reflects the 5 books of the law, which kind of tells you that the people who put the psalms together saw it as authoritative, just as authoritative as the law itself. And so you've got this, book of collection of psalms, the 5 books of the psalms coming together. So you've got the 5 books of Moses, and then you've got the 5 books of David, really, the psalms. Although, not every psalm comes from David, just like not every single line in the book of the law of Moses actually comes from Moses. But they're the 2 figures that are the ones that stand out for those 2 collections. And I think in terms of canon, that's what you've got up until the 1st century. You've got the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So at the end of Luke's gospel, when whenever Jesus talks about the canonical books, that's what he talks about, primarily the law, the prophets, and at one point in Luke 24, verse 44, he talks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And the Psalms is not shorthand, I think, for the writings, the 3rd section of the canon, because the 3rd section of the canon wasn't closed until after Jesus. The books were there individually, and the books were individually seen as authoritative, but no one had thought to kind of bring them together into a definitive collection yet. They were reading these books in the synagogue, and the synagogue is really important for understanding the development of the canon, because the synagogues, which initially began in the 1st century BC in Palestine, they were not initially places of worship. They were actually schools where teachers would teach students, and it was kind of modelled on the Greek gymnasium, which the Greek gymnasium wasn't just simply a place of physical training. It was a place of education. You came and there was a curriculum that you followed, and you were educated in stuff. And so the Pharisees, who were the prime movers in this, they weren't the only ones doing it, but they were the prime movers. The synagogues were places where teachers could teach students. And what they wanted to do was everyone had to read the law, everyone had to read the prophets. And then came the question, well, what other books should we read? What other books should be on our curriculum? To put it another way, what should be our canon? And the Psalms were absolutely part of that. And they were reading the books that are now in the writings. So we're talking about Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Daniel, Ruth, Esther, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, all those books. And they're reading them because they view them as authoritative. But it's not until the end of the 1st century the end of the 1st century AD that there is a question, well, should we now fix this collection so that we don't let any other books in? We just go, right, this is it. And they do that at the end of the 1st century. And Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, writing in Rome at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, he's writing at that time. And for him, the canon has been closed. There are 3 divisions by his time. There's the law, the prophets, and there's the writings. And so the canon at that point is closed. When Jesus, we see Jesus, even though there's only a canon of law, prophets, and Psalms, Jesus still alludes to those other books that make it into the writings, that kind of, are added to the Psalms as that final portion of the canon. He alludes to them. The New Testament writers allude to them. And it basically comes from the question, what are our authoritative books? And it's these. There are other books that, okay, they're worth reading. You can learn from them, but they are not as authoritative. And that raises the question, why were they not deemed authoritative? I think part of the answer for that is, number one, they were theologically suspect at points. And so these are the books that go into what we call the Apocrypha. The books of the Apocrypha, some of them just have some, theologically dodgy bits. They kind of read well most of the way, but every now and then something props up and you go, no, that doesn't kind of align with the canonical books. So that's one thing. The Pharisees also did a very interesting thing, and we're still living with their legacy in this. The Pharisees came up with what they called the oral law. They believed that if people were to please God, they had to follow the written law, which was in the canon, and they also had to follow the regulations that they themselves created. And in order to give their oral law authority, they attributed the oral law to Moses. Even though they had invented the oral law 5 minutes earlier, they said that it actually came from Moses and therefore was just as authoritative as the written law. And in order to, that began a process whereby they started to say anything that's authoritative is early. None of it is late. So our oral law, it's not actually late, it's really early. No biblical literature is late, it's all early. And so they started there's this trend where they find a known person in biblical literature and they say, oh, that person wrote that book. And while some of them seem quite logical, some of them are actually quite nonsensical, to be honest. The books of Samuel, the reason they're called the books of Samuel is because the Pharisees claimed Samuel wrote the books of Samuel. Samuel dies halfway through volume 1. He can't be the author
Again,
of
it's the Moses zombie problem.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but, they're claiming that Samuel wrote the history in, projecting it. And of course, he was divinely inspired. So, it followed exactly what happened. But no, that doesn't really make sense. God doesn't work that way. Even though he could, it's not how he chooses to work. And it's interesting that in the Greek translation, 1 and 2 Samuel are not actually called Samuel. They're called 1 and 2 Kingdoms. And the books of 1 and 2 Kings are called 3 and 4 Kingdoms because they follow one
Interesting.
story. And so that tradition of dating everything early started with the Pharisees. And effectively what they did was they depopulated these last 4 centuries before Jesus of any biblical authors. And because the Pharisees gained political power, they were able to enforce their view as law, binding on absolutely everyone. And we're still living with the legacy of that even to this day, because we have this notion that, these are 4 centuries of silence and no biblical literature was written in this period. But actually, no, that's just what the Pharisees did to prop up their own way of reading the scriptures, their hyper-literal, hyper-legal way of reading the scriptures, and to justify the authority of their own oral law.
It's so interesting, mate, because I mean that there's so many other parallels that we see in that period. I mean, you've got certainly the Gnostic texts that come after the New Testament that will claim that Jesus had secret teachings that he passed down to certain disciples, and so they carry an oral tradition that is authoritative. And then you've even got the kind of wing of oral tradition that's meant to be sustained within the Roman Catholic Church, where alongside the authority of the scriptures, you've also got the authority of the church and this tradition that is often leaned into to be able to justify certain sort of beliefs that come from that. There again, there's so many different questions that kind of sparks. I've got a couple. One that I found really interesting. Pardon me. Looking at the formation of the Jewish Bible is just its closing of the writings with the Chronicles, and you've got these strange genealogies. Then, and you're like, man, there's these chapters of genealogies which speak about the descendants of David, which don't seem to play any major role. And you're kind of wondering what's there. But if that was the end of the ordering for our English Bibles, all of a sudden you've got the New Testament opening with genealogies connecting Jesus with this Davidic line through Joseph and through Mary. And you're like, oh, wow, that all of a sudden makes so much more sense if we followed that same kind of ordering or structure, is to just trying to make that connection. There's this Davidic prophetic longing for this Messiah that's going to come up and of that line of David and fulfill all of Israel's hopes. And then you've got the claim of the gospel authors. This is who has arrived in Jesus. So I reckon maybe you and me can start a campaign that we reorder our English Bibles to follow that particular thing. And let's see how we go there. But I want to come back to this idea of maybe suspect theology in some of the intertestamental literature, because there are a lot of developments. I mean, you've already hinted. I mean, we've got the Samaritans, the Yahwists in what used to be the northern kingdom of Israel that got overthrown by the Assyrian Empire. And then you've got the Yahwists that are down in Jerusalem, the Jews who are developing their traditions and the rebuilding of the Second Temple era. But then all of a sudden we open the New Testament. We've got all these different sects, and I say that with an sects before anyone gets the wrong idea. You've got all these different sects within Judaism. You've got, which you don't see much of the Essenes, but what we call the Qumran community, who are these sort of separatists. You've got the Zealots, so Jesus ends up having at least one of these within his disciples, who were more political revolutionaries. You've got the Sadducees, which seem to be the inheritors of this priestly ruling class, kind of the Hasmonean influence that's passed down, and they're politically a lot more aligned with Rome, but you've got then the Pharisees, who are these religious purists. Could you speak a little bit more about how these different groups are influenced by the geopolitical events in that 400-year period, as well as then kind of the theological influences that come up from maybe any of that intertestamental literature as well?
Yeah, it's quite a complex process. And so, I commend to your audience the book, if you want the longer version. It is quite.
For those just joining, Bridging the Testaments, it's not a quick read, but definitely a worthy one.
These sects begin to develop in the 2nd century BC. In 198 BC, there's a massive political change. Before 198 BC, the Jewish community in Jerusalem and Judea were subject to the Ptolemaic dynasty. That was the dynasty founded by Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. And it's ruling Egypt. It's the last dynasty that rules Egypt before the Romans come along. And so Jerusalem is under the authority of the Ptolemaic dynasty that rules from Alexandria. But in 198, there is a change, and the region is conquered by the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucid dynasty was founded by Seleucus, another member of Alexander the Great's staff. So it's one of the kingdoms that came out of Alexander the Great's empire. And the Seleucid dynasty is ruling pretty much from Syria. Their capital is in Antioch, and they're ruling Syria, and they take possession of the region in the south. That is the region that includes Judea and Samaria. And the Jews themselves, particularly those who were in power, the high priest at the time, a guy called Simon II, and his cousins, who were essentially a mafia family known as the Tobiads. You've got to read the story. These guys are, it's Godfather material. It really is.
Wow.
And they are instrumental in turning the tables away from the Ptolemies and towards the Seleucids. And the Seleucid king at the time, Antiochus III, he is so thankful to the Jews for helping him in conquering the region that he gives them lots of concessions. Cool. Before this time, Jerusalem is a small town. It's a struggling town. It's really just a village up in the hills. It's, ideologically really important, but in terms of practical, importance on the ground, it doesn't have a lot going for it. But Antiochus III gives lots of concessions to Jerusalem. It becomes a tax haven for 3 years. And so everyone just comes to, the Ptolemies had taxed the life out of the people. And so to have taxes lifted completely was just wow. So Antiochus III is really benevolent towards the Jews. And people come to Jerusalem, and they now have some, they're starting to be prosperous for the first time in centuries. And this enables reflection on what it means to be a Jew. Because remember, the Sumerians are still up in the north, and they're claiming to be the heart of Israel. And the Jews are saying, no, we're the heart of Israel. And so now with the pressure off, people have the time and the opportunity to ask questions of what does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be an Israelite? What is God like? What does God want from us? And so you start to have various groups developing with different ideas about what it means to be a Jew. This is what we should be doing, or this is what we should not be doing. Add into the mix the fact that Greek influence had come into the region, and that Greek influence had provided, I guess, some new categories for Jews to adopt in their thinking. And so with this new opportunity to do some, deep theological reflection, lots of different groups develop. And you've also got the political developments of the time. The 2nd century BC is quite turbulent. So this period of, everything being rosy lasted about a decade before it started to go downhill. And then by 167 BC, things have exploded into a civil war in Judea, what we know as the Maccabean revolt. But by this time, we've got lots of different groups. So we've got the Sadducees developing. The Sadducees are connected to the priests who hold power. Sadducee basically is just means Zadokite, and Zadokite was the name of the line of the high priests. So the high priest had to be a Zadokite, and the Zadokites, the Sadducees, were supporters of the Zadokite priesthood. By 160 BC, there no longer is a Zadokite priest who, is governing the Jewish people. But the Sadducees still, they're kind of like the heirs of the Zadokite legacy. And most of them are priests, and they are all for priestly power. You've then got the Essenes, who develop out of an earlier group that were led by a mysterious guy whose name we unfortunately don't know, but he's referred to in the Qumran literature as the teacher of righteousness. And I wish we knew his name, I really do. But he was very instrumental in trying to shape Judaism in particular ways, and he was ultimately unsuccessful. And he and his group were eventually, a lot of them were murdered, chased out of Jerusalem, and they kind of developed this sect, which comes to be the Essenes, which is all about withdrawing from society into either a monastic community or just little enclaves within society, but very closed to the rest of the world. They are all about denouncing what's going on in the world, in society, and seeing themselves as the true faithful remnant. You've then got the Pharisees. The word Pharisee probably means separatist, and they are developing these really fundamental, ultra-fundamentalist laws about how you please God. You've got to follow these rules, and rules to the nth degree. And they developed these rules, this oral law, over a couple of centuries. But initially, they are overshadowed by the Maccabees. The Maccabees are the resistance fighters that are led initially by 5 brothers from the Hasmonean family, and they are the ones who challenge foreign rule over the Jewish community. They challenge liberals within Judaism who are kind of moving Judaism more towards being Greek and almost becoming indistinguishable from pagan Greek society. And they react against this, and they actually start picking up swords, and there is a violent resistance. And the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, those terms are kind of interchangeable. They are the ones who end up having power in Judaism, and the Sadducees kind of throw their support behind them. The reason for their support is these 5 Hasmonean brothers were priests themselves. And so it was natural that the Zadokites, the Sadducees, threw their support behind the Hasmoneans. But the Hasmoneans, eventually, they will become a dynasty of high priests, and eventually they will declare themselves kings as well. And once they do this, the Pharisees are kind of come into the mainstream. They're initially quite, a fringe group, but they become a mainstream group who are the ones who are, I guess, the loudest critics of the Hasmoneans. And the Sadducees are the supporters of the Hasmoneans, and so eventually the Sadducees and the Pharisees are the two big groups that dominate Judaism, and they hold political power, or they're vying for political power right down to the first century when the events of the Gospels take place.
So it's a two-party system in pretty much any country at any point in history, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, God, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Well, look, if we could talk a little bit, I want to share with you a TikTok, because one of the things that I wanted to get you on to just respond to is that there is an increasing chatter, particularly amongst kind of TikTok, where a lot of young people are being influenced with religious ideas and kind of questions about history. They're having them answered in terrible form, but around the role that intertestamental literature plays. And particularly the story goes largely that the books of the Apocrypha and the pseudepigrapha and other writings were intentionally suppressed because they revealed things that were too liberating or that shed too much light that would destroy traditional Judaism or Christianity. And so the church or the Jewish nation suppressed these books because they didn't want people to know the truth. But now we're rediscovering them, and this means we need to rewrite all of religious history and truth claims around it. So I'm going to play you one. I don't know if you've come across Billy Carson before. He just keeps getting propped up on big name podcasts around the place with some theories that need to be challenged by credible historians of your own ilk. But I'm going to play a short clip. This was watched by millions of people. It's got millions of views on YouTube. It's about the Book of 1 Enoch. And then I'd love to talk, you spoke about suspect theology before, just to talk about that as we go. So have a listen.
Know that Enoch was a real powerful man because he's talked about in the Bible, yet his book is not in the Bible. It was left out by accident on purpose. And the reason why is because he's talking about beings that were not from earth, that came here from up above and engaged mankind. They taught us how to build weapons. They taught us about perfume and makeup, taught us how to make jewelry and beer and all this other crazy stuff, right? They were having sex with humans. So these weren't like the angels that we're thinking with the fluffy wings. These were people. And these beings that came to visit gave him an appointed date that he would be taken away from Earth. And so he got taken away from Earth, and he didn't describe the shape of the Earth, a gigantic blue glowing sphere. He went away for a while, then comes back.
All right. So the kind of key theme, I mean, a million claims were made in there. I don't at all expect you to respond to every one, but the major idea is that the real truth pardon me, the real truth about reality tends to be in these suppressed books, and it plays into the narrative that the victors write history. The canonization process is really just the idea of keeping down the liberating truth that we all need to hear. And First and Second Enoch fall under the pseudepigraphal text, like you said before, people wanting to give ancient pedigree to fresh writings in order to try and establish their authority. But it does seem to elaborate a particular scene in Genesis, as many of these writings do elaborate other stories from earlier canonical texts, and add in a whole new theology, or at least elaborate extensively about spiritual beings and about interaction with humans and development of technology and other purposes that are there, of heavenly visions that Enoch received that aren't described at all in the book of Genesis when he actually existed a few thousand years back. But what's your take then on the sort of introductory theology, particularly about the afterlife and angels and demons, that we do find in books like Judith and 1 Enoch and other literature from that period leading up to Jesus?
Yeah, the book of 1 Enoch is an interesting case. The book of 1 Enoch, I don't think it's inventing traditions out of thin air. It's drawing on pre-existing traditions and giving them a particular shape that became really important for a particular group, most notably the Essenes. The Essenes were originally very, very close with groups that were associated with the book of Daniel, what we call, in the book I call them the intellectuals. The Hebrew word is the maskilim. And at some point around about the time of the Maccabean revolt in the 160s BC, there is a split between those who continue to, the intellectuals who continue to see the book of Daniel as authoritative, and then those who go off with the book of Enoch, and they end up becoming the Essenes and perhaps some other groups as well. The book of 1 Enoch is what we call an apocalypse, and it includes apocalyptic stuff. Apocalyptic is an interesting genre. It's the way I describe it is it's Platonic philosophy brought into Judaism. And what Platonic philosophy does is it says there's this world that we live in, the physical, mundane world, but it's connected to this other realm, this realm where ideas exist. And these ideas are ideals that govern the shape and texture of our world. So, just some really simple examples. There is, in this other realm, a perfect circle. A perfect circle. It's the ideal circle. And anything in this physical world that we live in that's circular participates in the idea of circleness. The more it participates, the more perfect that circle would be. And so there is this sense of trying to participate in this other realm and to participate as closely as possible to make things really good in this world. And that's just Platonic philosophy. And it comes into Judaism, and Judaism kind of says, well, that really, aligns with the way that we see God. God is in this other realm. And so he, to live well here is to be aligned with God and his ideals, etc., etc. And what the book of Enoch is trying to do is it gives one version of what it looks like to be aligned with God. And it depicts the character of Enoch being taken into this other world where he's shown the secrets of the universe. He's shown how the world works, what it looks like, how the calendar should work. And, this was one of the major things that the teacher of righteousness was trying to teach. He tried to reform Judaism by saying we should stop using a lunar calendar because we have to keep correcting it. Every year we're making, corrections to our calendar. We should just follow a solar calendar because it works perfectly. Whereas the law stipulates there is a lunar calendar. And so the book of 1 Enoch is giving an account of all of reality and what God really wants in this world. And it puts it within the storyline of what we see from Genesis with the character of Enoch, one of the, the patriarchs from Genesis 5, who basically gets a couple of verses and that's it in the book of Genesis. But this entire tradition of an apocalyptic mindset is given expression in the book of 1 Enoch. Now, to some extent, you can say, well, ultimately, those who advocated the book of 1 Enoch were the losers in history. Yeah, that's true. That is absolutely true. But more than that, some of the stuff that comes into the book of 1 Enoch just simply doesn't align with the rest of what we see in canonical scripture. A lot of it does, by the way. It's not like everything that the book of 1 Enoch says is, rubbish or anything like that. A lot of it aligns with what we see in the canonical scriptures, but not enough of it does. And that's why people were reading it. They were interacting with it. Everyone knows it. In the New Testament, Jude even quotes it. And so, it's seen as quite an influential, authoritative book, but it's ultimately not seen as authoritative. So it's a little bit like, if I were to give a sermon, and I quote from books of the Bible, and then I throw in something from Shakespeare, it's, what am I saying? Well, everyone knows Shakespeare, and, if I drop the line to be or not to be, it resonates with everyone because everyone knows it. But it doesn't mean I think Shakespeare is canonical and that I should include Shakespeare in my Bible. It just simply means it's quite popular and it resonates with people and they'll know what I'm talking about. And so that's really what the book of 1 Enoch is like. It ultimately has some theological dodgy bits. but it's picking up on traditions, I think some pre-existing traditions that are there about Enoch, but it's really trying to give expression of what a lot of biblical authors were trying to do, of, what is this world like, and what does it mean to live in alignment with God's will and God's desires. And that apocalyptic mindset, actually every New Testament writer that I can see has this apocalyptic mindset, where there is this world we live in, there is a spiritual world which influences what goes on here. And so what we see here kind of aligns with this spiritual world. And once we understand the spiritual significance of things, you've actually unlocked something. You've actually uncovered things that can help you please God. You've got a sense of what is spiritually good and what is spiritually bad. Every New Testament writer has that mindset. Jesus himself ultimately has that mindset too. I mean, if you just think about the Lord's Prayer, when he says, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," there's that idea of aligning the realms kind of thing. But ultimately the Book of Enoch, it doesn't quite align fully with what we see in the canonical scriptures, and ultimately that's why it gets left by the wayside.
And I think that's such an interesting feature of this intertestamental literature, if we're going to call it what that category is normally put at, even though I just committed a grave sin and I ask your forgiveness. I remember during my first seminary degree, actually just taking a weekend to sit down and read all of the books that make up the Apocrypha, and then a few from the pseudepigrapha, including 1st and 2nd Enoch. And just finding, wow, this is really interesting. And there's a lot of ideas in here that have passed into pop culture. I mean, you've got names of certain archangel figures like Raphael, for instance, and Uriel that come out in those books. But you've also got kind of theological claims that you're like, oh, I don't know exactly where this fits. And it's interesting to try and figure out how much of this theology shaped the context into which Jesus and his apostles were writing, particularly developments in things like the afterlife, which in the Old Testament, it's fairly scarce. You mostly this idea of going down to the grave or to Sheol, to some watery, semi-conscious, potentially existence. You've got the promise of resurrection in just a few places, but sort of what happens beyond, what is the final fate, are just questions where there's not a whole lot done. But then you've got books like Judith, which start giving a lot more explicit kind of context around afterlife, and you're wondering, how much of this is shaping the language of New Testament authors, or how much are they purely bouncing off prophetic literature in the Old Testament? Are just unknown questions a little bit. How do you kind of, as you're talking about development of theology and progressive revelation, how do you think New Testament authors, how much cue do they take from some of this literature that isn't included in the Old Testament canon?
They're taking their cue from, I don't think they're necessarily taking their cue just from, I guess, what we'd call apocryphal literature. Yes, they are influenced by them to some extent. I think they're influenced by the mindset that gives rise to some of the apocryphal literature, and
could you spell that out a little?
Of the biblical literature. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Greek influence is really pivotal in this. Greek influence began in the 4th century BC, even before Alexander the Great arrived. Alexander the Great kind of was riding a wave. He didn't initiate it. He kind of completed the process, really. And the Greeks we're thinking primarily about Greek philosophy, this idea that you can observe things empirically in the world and you can rationally think about, deduce ideas about what life is. What's the meaning of life? What does it mean to be a human? What's on the other side? Is there another side? All those kinds of things. And Plato's philosophy was highly influential in Judaism. Aristotle's was as well, but Plato, I think, takes pride of place because his philosophical system was very similar to the way that Jews thought about God. And so they Platonic philosophy gave Judaism some categories that helped them graduate their thinking. Cool. It wasn't like, the Jews couldn't think for themselves and, they needed Greeks to come and tell them how to think. Not that at all. It's just that these were ways of thinking that helped Jewish people express the theology that they had in better ways. And we must remember, we mustn't be afraid of this notion of progressive revelation. As I said, God was in constant relationship with his covenant people, and that relationship developed, and knowledge of God naturally developed as the relationship continued. And so as new things happened, as new prophets came along, theology developed. And one of those ways was through the introduction of Greek categories of thinking. And so by the time we get to the New Testament, Greek thinking had thoroughly soaked through Judaism. And there were aspects of, Greek thought which were counter to Judaism. There, and Judaism really struggled. This is where the struggle really was. How much of Greek culture and philosophy do we adopt, and how much do we resist? That question led to the explosion of civil war and resistance in the 2nd century BC. But this notion of thinking that there is another realm out there, this spiritual realm, Plato's realm of the ideas or forms, and Judaism's spiritual realm, this is really important. The spiritual realm has, for example, as we see in the book of Daniel, it's got these beasts, these monstrous hybrid beasts that are embodied by empires through history. And you can understand what's going on through history, not just simply by looking at the empires, but by understanding the spiritual significance of these empires. And so that gives rise to, some new ideas. Resurrection, I think, and an afterlife is one of those ideas, as you mentioned. Before the onset of Greek influence, I think the average Jew, and we see this in biblical literature in the Old Testament, thought that, well, when you died, no matter who you were, righteous or wicked, whoever you were, you ended up in this place called Sheol, the underworld. And it was this murky, shady place, and it was almost like a state of suspended animation. You were there, and yet nothing happened, kind of thing. It's just, you were kind of stored there. But that raised questions. That configuration raised questions. And one of the things that Greek influence did, and particularly the experience of Jews in these critical centuries under Greek influence, was you ended up with a situation where the righteous, those who wanted to please God and were pleasing God, they were following the law, they were doing what God required, they were, following all the cultural mandates, all the moral demands of the law, and yet they were suffering. And this goes totally against the nature of the written law, the Torah, that we have in our Old Testaments, because the nature of the national covenant,
obedience would lead to blessing rather than to suffering.
And that's exactly the dynamic that we see in the law. If you do the right thing, God blesses you. And blessing just looks like being able to live securely and successfully. It doesn't mean rolling around in cash, that kind of thing. It just means living in the land that God promised to the patriarchs with safety, and being able to live to a ripe old age and see your children, your grandchildren, and maybe your great-grandchildren. That's what it means to be righteous and to have the blessing of the righteous. And the wicked are those who oppress others, those who don't follow the law, those who are evil, those who conspire, all those kinds of things, who have no regard for God, are lax in their worship. They were the ones who were succeeding in life. And they were the ones who were coming to power, and they were holding on to the power, and they were oppressing the righteous. And so everything seemed to be turned on its head. The book of Ecclesiastes is, exploring this very conundrum. And so the righteous were dying before vindication. And so people were then asking, well, does this mean God is unjust? Is God just going to let the wicked get away with it? And will the righteous never see vindication? I mean, they're all in their graves now. What's going to happen? But when Greek influence comes along and they start thinking about this other realm, they develop a notion of the soul, that bit of me, which is in that other spiritual realm, the spirit bit of me, that doesn't necessarily die when I die physically. And so that gave the Jewish people a way of saying, well, if God is just, as we see in the scriptures, there must be some time in the future when God will put everything right. The wicked will get their just deserts. The righteous will get vindication. What's that going to look like? There must be some kind of eschatological resurrection at the end of time. God will raise the dead. There will be a day of judgment and everything will be put right. And the way God can do that is because I have this soul that exists in this spiritual realm. While I kind of might go down to Sheol, yet God still holds my soul, and he can, being the creator that he is, who can create things out of nothing, he can certainly rebuild me out of my soul. And so there will be a day of resurrection to come. And so this hope for God to vindicate the righteous in the future came about, developed through Greek influence. And the New
certainly
Testament
through the
writers are
prophetic
building
books as
on
well.
that. Yeah, exactly. So if you believe that God is as he is in Scripture, in the Old Testament, you've got to end up believing that there is a day of resurrection. And this is, a logical theological development that comes out of what we see in the Scriptures.
Mate, that again raises a whole range of questions, and I think particularly one that maybe we'll need to pick up in the next episode that we get you on for is just this idea of religious development. I'm fully on board, like you said, with the concept of progressive revelation and learning more about God, and just trying to tease out what is revelation from God, and that what is just evolution in human thinking. Are there differences between those two things? And one of the things that will be great to touch on, we'll wrap things up for now, but will be this idea that you speak about often throughout the book of henotheism. A lot of the listeners will be familiar with monotheism, the idea that there is one God, but henotheism is the idea that there are territorial gods, so that each particular geographical location around the world has a patron deity, so to speak, and they're somewhat in competition, or that you live within the blessing of their borders and have different relationships. And that certainly seems to be a feature of what we see in the Old Testament story. This is often
in the Old Testament, yes.
And this is often raised as an objection against Christianity, saying, look, this looks just like very much of a human evolution in religious thinking. This doesn't look like at all what you would expect if there is some kind of breaking in from the outside of spiritual revelation of God speaking to be able to counteract these false theological beliefs. And so I think that'll be a great theme for us to pick up in the next one, along with some of these prophetic differences that emerged. What are the expectations of the Messiah that developed across this period? Are they competing? Do they really culminate in Jesus? Why was he rejected for not fitting the bill by some of the Jews of his own time? These will be some great things for us to tease out when we get a part 2 with you at some point in the future. But I just want to say a huge thanks as we are just scratching the surface of some of the rich historical insights that are part of the book. It really is, as I shared at the beginning, for people that are just joining, something that you can follow along from the beginning and just in a narrative way learn a lot about history. You've pulled together a range of different literary and archaeological sources to spell out what is the development across these periods. And there were some things that I knew and a lot that I didn't reading through here. And so you're filling in all kinds of holes in my own thinking that I really appreciated and just find fruitful for raising new questions that we get to keep wrestling with. George, I'll obviously put links to the book and to your academic profile in the show notes for this episode, but we often just invite our guests to leave a parting message with anyone who might be exploring what Christianity is all about and sort of where they sit on the God and Jesus and the Bible stuff. As someone who spent a lot of time bridging the Testaments and what is revealed about God in the Old and his purposes for the world, and then what we see play out in the New, what would be a parting message that you might leave to anyone considering Christianity?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'd say that Christianity shows us a God who is transcendent. He's so fantastically other, but he's a God who gets his hands dirty in history. He's a God who interacts with people. This is a dynamic God who is who is not distant. He's interested in people. He's interested in what goes on in people's lives. And he's interested in, the big things in history. He's interested in the tiny little things in people's lives. And he has interacted with people. That I think is the amazing thing about God. He was involved in history. And once we see the story of how God gets involved in history down through the centuries, we realise just how magnificent Jesus is. Jesus is the crowning moment of God's involvement with humanity. And I think once we understand that story leading up to that, the climactic resolution of God's story with humanity, we see just how fantastic Jesus is. And Jesus is worth investing your time in. He's magnificent. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, mate, thank you for your time. If anyone has questions for Reverend Dr. George Athas, please do send them in via our social media channels. We'll definitely set up another episode in the future so you can field questions, particularly around prophecy. I'm super interested in prophecy personally, whether or not that's a good way of pointing people to Jesus in our modern world, and how do we do that well. I'd love to talk about the book of Daniel and different prophecies that come up through there. You've got some fascinating interpretations, particularly of the four kingdoms in Daniel 2, that maybe is different to what people expect from the normal play out of history. So I look forward to doing a future episode. Just want to say thanks for coming on the channel.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's been good.
Great. Well, we'll put links to all of George's books, as well as then his profile in the show notes if you want to follow up further. Just want to say a huge thank you to getting to the end of these conversation series. We hope wrestling with these big ideas and topics, that it helps you really wrestle with God and see the Christian story really is worth believing. We're big fans of saying that truth invites questioning. So if you want to find any more of our video content, we do short 5 to 10 minute responses to big questions, as well as this long form conversational format. Please do check out our YouTube channel for plenty more. Follow us at QC Socials over on Facebook and Instagram and on TikTok, where we often break down these videos with a whole range of infographics and other written content. And on our website, you can ask away with your own questions, and we'll continue to make video content to do that. If you want to support the channel or anything that we're doing here at Questioning Christianity, you can go to the website and our donate page, or click down below to look at our support page on Patreon. Other than that, as always, truth invites questioning, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.